He had always dreamed of living somewhere quiet, away from the constant noise and chaos of the city. After spending years working in law enforcement, dealing with emergencies and leading people through high-pressure situations, he wanted nothing more than peace. So when he finally bought a small ranch on the outskirts of town, it felt like a reward for all those years of hard work. The air was cleaner there, the nights were calm, and the sound of horses moving softly in the barn became his favorite kind of music. The ranch sat on a few acres of land surrounded by wide open fields. There was a small pond at the back, some trees that gave just enough shade, and a long gravel driveway that led up to a cozy farmhouse. He didn't want anything fancy, just something simple where he could breathe, think, and live quietly. Most mornings he would wake up before sunrise, pour himself a cup of coffee, and walk out to the stables to check on the horses. That peaceful routine became his therapy. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors waved when they passed by, and a few even stopped by to welcome him to the community. It felt nice, though he could tell some of them were curious about the new guy with the horses. He didn't tell anyone about his job. He preferred to keep that part of his life private. Out here, he wasn't the man with authority or a title. He was just a ranch owner enjoying his quiet corner of the world. The neighborhood was part of a community run by a homeowners association, or HOA. He had heard mixed opinions about HOAs before. Some said they kept neighborhoods clean and orderly. Others said they went too far, policing things that didn't matter. He figured it wouldn't be a problem. He wasn't the kind of man to break rules. As long as they let him live peacefully, he had no reason to complain. But peace has a strange way of attracting trouble. Not long after he settled in, he received his first letter from the HOA. It wasn't anything serious, just a note saying his front gate needed to be painted a community-approved color. He smiled, shrugged, and painted it the exact shade they suggested. He didn't mind small things like that. But it didn't end there. A few weeks later, another letter arrived. This time it said his fence was too tall by association standards. He checked the measurements himself, and it was exactly what the county allowed. Still, he adjusted it slightly, hoping to avoid problems. Then one afternoon, while he was feeding the horses, he noticed a woman standing near the edge of his driveway. She was taking pictures of the barn with her phone. When he walked over to ask if she needed help, she quickly said she was with the HOA and was documenting code violations. He was polite, asked what the issue was, and she replied sharply that livestock structures were not permitted within 50 feet of the property line. He calmly explained that his barn had been approved by the county before he bought the property. But she didn't seem interested in listening. She scribbled something on her clipboard and told him he'd hear from the board soon. That was his first real encounter with her. From that day on, she seemed to have her eyes on his ranch constantly. He would catch glimpses of her car parked at the corner, phone camera pointed in his direction. Sometimes she'd slow down as she passed by, pretending to be checking her GPS, but he could tell she was watching. It was odd, almost comical at first. He didn't understand what she was trying to prove. Still, he told himself not to overreact. Years in law enforcement had taught him one thing: never escalate when you can stay calm. But she didn't stop. Within a few days, another notice came from the HOA, claiming his barn lights were too bright after 9 p.m. He found that strange because he rarely turned them on. Then came another saying his driveway gravel was not the correct texture approved by the association. It was getting ridiculous. Each letter was more aggressive than the last. One morning, while cleaning out the barn, he saw her again, standing near his fence line, arms crossed, shaking her head like she had caught someone committing a crime. He walked over and greeted her with a friendly smile. "Good morning," he said kindly. "Is there something wrong?" She replied in a stern tone that his property didn't fit the community's aesthetic standards. He tried to stay polite, even offered her a cup of coffee from the thermos he carried. She refused, saying she didn't socialize with rule breakers. That was the first time he saw a flash of hostility in her eyes. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. Later that evening, he sat on his porch sipping tea and thinking, why was she so determined to cause trouble? Maybe she was just one of those people who needed to feel in control. He decided to stay patient. He had seen far worse attitudes in his career. Still, something about her persistence felt unsettling. A few days later, the HOA sent a formal letter accusing him of violating multiple property codes. It listed fence height, animal noise, and unapproved modifications. The fines added up to a few $100s. He read it twice, then calmly filed it away. He had nothing to hide. Every structure on his land was approved and inspected. He wasn't about to pay for something that wasn't true, but she didn't stop there. The next weekend, while he was out fixing the gate, her car pulled up again. She rolled down her window and said, "You think you can do whatever you want here, don't you?" He turned toward her, still calm, and said softly, "Ma'am, I'm just living quietly on my property. I'm following every rule. Please don't come here uninvited." Her face tightened. "We'll see about that," she snapped and drove off, tires kicking gravel behind her. After that, things got even stranger. She started calling animal control, claiming his horses were making too much noise at night. Then she complained about strange lights behind his barn, though they were just solar lamps he used for safety. It was becoming harassment, but instead of reacting in anger, he began documenting everything. Each letter, each visit, each time she trespassed. He noted it all with times and dates. Deep down, he knew there was something bigger behind her behavior. It wasn't about the HOA or the rules, it was about control. Some people simply couldn't handle others living freely without their permission. He'd seen that type before. People who gained a little authority and used it to make others miserable. Despite all this, he refused to let her ruin the peace he had built. He continued his daily routine, caring for the animals, maintaining the ranch, and greeting other neighbors with a smile. Most of them were kind and supportive. Some even whispered that she had done the same thing to others before, sending complaints over small things like mailbox size or grass height. It seemed like she always needed someone to target. One evening, while sitting by the fence watching the sunset, he thought about how ironic it was. All his years as a police director had been spent protecting people from real dangers, violence, crime, tragedy. Now here he was, being hassled over paint colors and fences by a woman who didn't even know who he was. He smiled quietly to himself. If only she knew. He could have easily used his position to stop her immediately. But he didn't want that. He wanted to handle it like any ordinary citizen, to see how far she would go when she thought she was dealing with someone powerless. Maybe part of him wanted to understand the psychology of people like her. One day, while driving home from town, he noticed her car parked right in front of his gate again. This time she was taking photos of the horses. He rolled down his window and said firmly but respectfully, "Please leave my property. This is private land." She shouted something about community violations and sped away. He sighed, shaking his head. That night, as the wind rustled through the trees, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee and looked out across the fields. The moonlight touched the surface of the pond, and everything looked peaceful again. He thought about how fragile peace could be, how one person's bitterness could disturb something so simple and good. But he made up his mind that evening. He wasn't going to let this turn into a war. He would remain calm, follow the rules, and collect every piece of evidence he needed. Eventually, the truth would reveal itself. He didn't know yet how far she was willing to go. He didn't know that her obsession would soon cross a dangerous line. All he knew then was that the peace he had built was being tested, and that he would face it with patience, as he always had. The horses neighed softly in the distance. The wind grew colder, and somewhere far off a coyote called. He took a slow breath, looked up at the stars, and whispered to himself, "Let's see how far this goes." He had no idea that what started as a few HOA complaints was about to turn into one of the strangest and most unbelievable experiences of his life. The following week started quietly, and for a short time, he almost believed things had settled down. The mornings were calm again, the horses were healthy, and he spent most of his time fixing small things around the ranch. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the peace broke again. People like her rarely stopped. And he was right. Late one afternoon, as he was cleaning the stalls, he noticed tire marks near his fence line. It looked like someone had pulled up close to the property, maybe even walked around. He checked his cameras, and sure enough, there she was again. The footage showed her stepping out of her car with her phone, snapping photos of the barn and the field before driving off. He sighed, shaking his head. It wasn't shocking anymore. He had started expecting her visits, but what did surprise him was how determined she seemed. It wasn't normal curiosity. It was an obsession. The next morning he found another letter in his mailbox. This one was from the HOA, claiming that he was operating a commercial facility on residential land. He read the letter twice, almost laughing in disbelief. He wasn't selling anything. He wasn't hosting visitors. It was just his home and his horses. He sat down at his kitchen table, pen in hand, and wrote a calm response. He explained that his animals were personal, that his ranch was fully registered as residential, and that there was no violation. He mailed it back that same afternoon, but something told him that the letter wouldn't change much. That weekend, while driving into town, he saw her again at the local grocery store. She was standing in line behind him, talking loudly to another woman. She was saying things like, "That man on the ranch is ruining the neighborhood, and he's probably hiding something." Her voice carried across the aisle, loud enough for others to hear. He turned slightly, looked at her, and gave a polite nod. She froze for a second, caught off guard, but then lifted her chin like nothing happened. He could have confronted her right there, but he didn't. He simply paid for his groceries and walked out. There was no point in arguing with someone who had already made up their mind. Later that evening, one of his neighbors dropped by. She was an older lady who lived 2 houses down. She said quietly, "I don't mean to intrude, but that woman from the HOA has been telling people strange things about you." He smiled and thanked her for letting him know. "I appreciate it," he said gently. "But I'm not worried. The truth always comes out." He meant it too. Years of experience had taught him to stay steady when others lost control. And this situation, as frustrating as it was, wasn't about anger. It was about patience and evidence. Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that things were getting worse. The letters became more frequent, each one more unreasonable than the last. They accused him of things like failing to maintain grass height and creating unnecessary noise disturbances. One letter even mentioned unapproved activity after dark. He began to notice that her tone was getting more personal too. Instead of formal language, she started using phrases like, "You continue to disregard this community's values." It was clear she had turned it into some kind of personal battle. One evening, he decided to document everything properly. He created a folder where he kept copies of every letter, every photograph, every timestamp from his cameras. He even noted the times he saw her drive by. He wasn't preparing for revenge, he was preparing for clarity, because one day someone would need to see the full picture. A few days later, he came home to find her parked right at his front gate again. This time she didn't even try to hide what she was doing. She was standing there with her phone out, recording a video of his horses grazing. He stepped out of his truck and approached slowly. His voice was calm but firm. "Ma'am, you need to leave my property. You're trespassing." She turned to him sharply, eyes wide with offense. "I'm doing my job. The HOA has a right to inspect properties." He kept his tone steady. "Not without notice and not without permission. This is private land." She rolled her eyes. "You think the rules don't apply to you because you've got a big piece of land?" "That's not how things work here." He didn't respond. He just stood there quietly until she huffed, turned, and stormed back to her car. He watched her drive off, a mix of annoyance and pity in his chest. It wasn't anger he felt anymore, it was sadness. She wasn't doing this for the good of the community. She was doing it because she needed someone to control, someone to challenge. That night, he talked to a few more neighbors. Many of them admitted she had caused problems for them too. One man said she fined him for planting flowers that didn't match community color standards. Another woman said she received a warning for leaving her trash bin out too long. It was clear now that this was her pattern. She thrived on power and fear. Over the next few weeks, her behavior only got worse. She started sending letters twice a week, sometimes even hand-delivering them. She'd stand on his porch, knock loudly, and leave an envelope taped to his door if he didn't answer. Each letter carried a new accusation, sometimes ridiculous ones like improper gate alignment. He began to wonder how someone could have so much time to focus on other people's lives. But he never reacted the way she wanted. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just kept doing what he always did, taking care of his horses, maintaining his land, and living peacefully. Still, he could feel the tension in the air growing heavier. One late evening, as he sat on his porch under the dim porch light, he saw headlights moving slowly down the road. It was her again. The car slowed near his mailbox and he saw her arm reach out of the window, snapping pictures with her phone. Then she sped off. He quietly smiled to himself. She was only helping his case now. The footage from his cameras would make everything clear later. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week. He decided to attend. He had avoided those gatherings before, preferring to stay out of neighborhood politics. But now it felt necessary. He wanted to face things directly, calmly, and in person. When the evening came, he walked into the small community hall where the meeting was held. About a dozen residents were seated around a long table. At the front sat the HOA board, and of course she was there, arms crossed, wearing that same look of disapproval. He took a seat quietly. The meeting began with routine matters, lawn maintenance, upcoming community projects, and event schedules. Then the topic shifted. She cleared her throat dramatically and said, "There is one resident who continues to disregard multiple HOA regulations. I have documented everything. I believe further action is needed." She didn't say his name, but everyone in the room knew who she meant. The board members exchanged glances. One of them asked, "Do you have any solid evidence of violations?" She held up a thick folder of papers and photos. "Everything is here," she said proudly. He refuses to comply. He waited patiently until she finished speaking, then raised his hand. "May I respond?" The room quieted. He stood up slowly, opened his own folder, and began placing documents on the table. Property permits, inspection reports, official clearance letters, and photos with timestamps. Every single claim she made, he calmly disproved. He showed the original county approval for his barn, the exact measurement of his fence, and even the sound level readings for his animals, which were all within limits. By the time he finished, the room was silent. The other board members looked stunned. One of them asked, "So everything you've done is legal and approved?" He nodded. "Yes, every single thing." Then he looked directly at her and said in a calm, steady voice, "I understand you care about the neighborhood, and I respect that. But this has gone beyond rules. It has become personal, and that's not what this community is supposed to be about." For a moment she had no words. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Her face turned red, but she stayed silent. One of the other residents spoke up quietly. "I think we've all seen enough. It looks like he's done everything right." Another nodded. "Honestly, I think he's been more patient than most of us would have been." He thanked them all politely and sat back down. The meeting wrapped up shortly after. When it ended, a few neighbors came over to shake his hand. They said things like, "You handled that well, and she's been doing this for years. It's about time someone stood up." He smiled humbly and thanked them, but he didn't gloat. That wasn't his style. He just wanted peace, not revenge. As he drove home that night, he felt a quiet sense of relief. He hoped that would be the end of it, that maybe now she'd finally stop. But deep down he knew better. He could feel it. People like her don't back down easily. They just wait for another angle, and he was right. Because what came next would be far worse than a few angry letters or accusations. It would cross a line no one expected her to cross. Days passed after the HOA meeting, and for a short while, it felt like the tension in the neighborhood had eased. The letters stopped coming, the street felt quieter, and he could finally focus on his ranch again. He even started to believe that maybe the confrontation at the meeting had made her realize she'd gone too far. But peace never lasts long when someone's pride is wounded. One morning, as he walked out to feed the horses, he noticed something odd near the fence. A section of wire had been cut clean through. It wasn't an accident. The edges were sharp, sliced by something. He checked the rest of the perimeter and found another spot the same way. He didn't jump to conclusions, but deep inside, he already knew who might be responsible. He quietly repaired the fence, checked the camera footage, and saved the clips. Sure enough, the recording showed her car stopping near the area the night before. He didn't see her face clearly, but the license plate told the story. He didn't call anyone or cause a scene. He just kept the video safe. That day, he decided to install a few more cameras, small, barely noticeable ones around the gate and barn area. It wasn't about catching anyone for revenge. He just wanted to be ready if something else happened. For a few days, everything seemed calm again. He stuck to his usual routine: coffee at dawn, checking the animals, small repairs around the ranch. He talked to his neighbors, shared small laughs, and pretended everything was normal. But behind that calm face, he stayed alert. One afternoon, while fixing the roof of the storage shed, he heard a car engine idling near the front of his driveway. He looked over and saw her car again. She wasn't even trying to hide anymore. She stood outside her car, holding her phone up, filming him. He climbed down slowly and walked toward the fence, keeping his voice calm. "Ma'am, please stop recording me on my property," he said softly. She smirked and replied, "This is for the board's records." "You're still in violation," he sighed. "There's no violation. You already saw the paperwork. The board confirmed everything is fine." Her voice rose, sharp and cutting. "I don't care what they said. I know you're breaking the rules. You're not fooling me." He could see the anger in her eyes. It wasn't about the ranch anymore. It was about power, about not wanting to lose control. He didn't argue. He simply turned around and walked back to the barn. She kept yelling something behind him, but he ignored it. His silence probably frustrated her even more. That night, he sat on his porch watching the stars, thinking about how quickly people could turn bitter. He had spent his whole career dealing with conflict, people shouting, lying, breaking rules. And yet this quiet little community had more drama than half the cases he'd handled in the city. The next morning, another letter showed up. This one didn't come from the HOA office. It was handwritten and slid under his door. The handwriting was shaky, but the message was clear. "You don't belong here. You think you can walk around like you own the place. The HOA doesn't need people like you." He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his file with the others. The words didn't scare him, but they did confirm what he already suspected. This had gone beyond an argument. It had become personal harassment. Still, he didn't lose his calm. He continued recording everything, saving every message, every detail. He wasn't planning to react unless it became absolutely necessary. A few days later, there was another HOA meeting. He didn't attend this one, but a neighbor who did came by afterward to tell him that she had tried to bring up his name again. The board members had shut her down quickly, saying the issue was already resolved. That only made her angrier. According to the neighbor, she stormed out halfway through the meeting, saying she'd handle it herself. That phrase stuck in his mind. Handle it herself. He didn't know exactly what she meant, but his instincts told him to stay alert. Years of experience in law enforcement had given him a sixth sense for when something wasn't right. The next evening, he saw her car pass by his house twice within an hour. Each time she slowed down near the gate, then drove away. The third time, she actually stopped and sat there for several minutes before leaving. He decided to check the footage again later. The cameras showed exactly that, her circling the property repeatedly. He didn't confront her. He didn't even mention it to the board. He just documented it quietly, knowing that one day, all of this would come together to show the truth. But as the days went on, her behavior grew bolder. She began walking her dog right up to his fence, stopping and staring at him whenever he was outside. Sometimes she'd shout across the field, "You think you're better than everyone here, or this neighborhood doesn't need people like you." He'd simply wave politely and go back to work. His calmness seemed to confuse her. She wanted a fight, but he wouldn't give her one. One Sunday morning, when most of the neighbors were at church, she showed up again. This time, she parked her car halfway on his driveway and started taking pictures of his house from the front. He came out and stood near the porch. "You're trespassing again," he said, still polite. She snapped, "Don't tell me what to do. I have every right to make sure our rules are being followed." He took a slow breath and said, "You don't have that right without permission. You need to leave now." Her face turned red. "You think you can scare me? I know people in the HOA. You'll regret this." He didn't say another word. He just walked back inside and quietly noted the time and date. Later that evening, he forwarded all his records, letters, videos, timestamps, to the HOA board and asked for a written acknowledgement that his property was compliant. Within 2 days, they sent a formal reply confirming everything was indeed within regulations. That document, more than anything, gave him a sense of calm. But she wasn't done. A week later, she started spreading new rumors. One of his neighbors mentioned that she was telling people he was keeping dangerous animals on his land, and that she had proof. Another said she claimed he was running an unlicensed business. None of it was true, but he let her talk. Lies always collapse under their own weight. Then one late afternoon, something happened that made him realize things had gone too far. He was out by the barn, repairing a gate hinge when he heard shouting near the front. At first, he thought it was kids playing. But when he looked up, he saw her car stopped at the gate again, and this time she had gotten out. She was pacing back and forth, yelling at someone on the phone, waving her arms dramatically. He stayed where he was, watching quietly. He didn't want to escalate it. After a few minutes, she turned toward the house, pointed directly at him, and shouted something he couldn't make out. Then she got back in her car and drove away fast. He decided that was enough. That evening, he called the HOA president directly and explained everything, calmly, professionally, with evidence. He sent copies of every letter and video clip. The president apologized and said the board would issue her a written warning for harassment. That warning came 2 days later. It should have been the end of it. But instead, it only made her angrier. After receiving the letter, she started showing up even more often. Sometimes she'd park her car at the edge of his property and just sit there for half an hour. Other times, she'd walk her dog past his gate, muttering under her breath. He could see that she was losing control, unable to accept that her authority had limits. One evening, as he stood on his porch, watching the sun go down, he thought about how strange people could be. She didn't know who he was or what he did for a living. To her, he was just some man with a ranch who didn't follow her orders. If only she knew that the man she was trying to intimidate was the very person in charge of the county's police operations. He never used his title or power to threaten her, because that wasn't who he was. But a small part of him wondered what she'd think if she found out. Would she finally stop? Or would it make her even angrier? He didn't have to wait long to find out, because soon her obsession would take her across a line she should never have crossed. That night, after locking up the barn, he saw something move near the fence line, a shadow, quick and quiet. He turned on his flashlight, but by the time he reached the gate, there was no one there. Only fresh footprints in the dirt. He looked toward the road, and in the faint light, he saw her car speeding away. He stood there for a moment, the cool night breeze brushing against his face, and thought to himself, this isn't just about rules anymore. This is personal. He walked back toward the house, locked the doors, and set his security system. As he poured himself a cup of tea, he looked out through the window at the still, silent fields. He didn't know it yet, but the next encounter would change everything. It wouldn't be another letter or another argument. It would be something far more serious, something that would finally reveal who he really was, and how far she was willing to go when pride turned into obsession. The days after the HOA meeting were quieter, at least on the surface. The man thought maybe things had finally cooled down. He continued his daily routine, feeding the horses early in the morning, walking the property, and keeping things in order around the ranch. The air was crisp most mornings, and he loved the peace that came with hearing nothing but the wind and the soft sounds of his animals. For the first time in months, he actually felt a bit of calm returning. But that calm didn't last long. Even though Karen had been embarrassed during the meeting, she didn't seem ready to let things go. There were little signs, fresh tire marks on the gravel near the edge of his property, someone clearly standing too close to the gate late at night, and letters with no names, just complaints written in all caps about rule violations. It was almost like she wanted him to know she was still watching, still angry. He didn't react. He just kept documenting everything. That was his nature, calm, patient, and always prepared. He had worked long enough in law enforcement to know when a situation could take a turn, and he could feel that this one wasn't finished. A week later, one of his neighbors stopped by to tell him that Karen had been talking to people around the neighborhood again, saying he was some kind of fake cop who used scare tactics to silence the HOA. The neighbor, who had seen how patient he had been through it all, simply shook his head. "She's digging her own hole," he said. "Just stay steady," he nodded. "That's the plan." That weekend, he spent the morning mending a section of his fence that had come loose after a small storm. The sky was bright blue, and for once he wasn't thinking about the HOA or Karen. He was just focused on the work. The rhythmic sound of the hammer against wood and the smell of pine made him feel grounded. By mid-afternoon, he was taking a break near the barn, sipping cold water and watching his horses graze when he noticed a familiar car slowly creeping down the dirt road. It was her. He sighed, stood up, and watched from a distance as the silver SUV stopped near the front gate. She didn't get out right away. Instead, she sat there for a moment, clearly arguing with herself. Then the door opened and she stepped out, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, and that same determined look on her face. He walked toward the gate slowly, staying calm. "Afternoon," he said evenly. She didn't respond at first. She just started taking pictures of the fence, muttering something under her breath. Then she turned sharply. "You still haven't removed this structure," she snapped, pointing toward the barn. "The board voted, and you're in violation," he exhaled softly. "Karen, this barn was approved by the county years before I bought this land. You don't have the authority to—" She cut him off. "Don't you talk to me like that. You think you can hide behind your badge and break every rule here?" He blinked slowly. "I'm not hiding behind anything. I'm living peacefully. You're trespassing again." That word, trespassing, seemed to ignite something in her. Her face turned red and her voice grew sharper. "This whole community belongs to the association. You're on our property when you step outside that fence." He stayed calm but firm. "This is my land, Karen. Please leave before this turns into something it doesn't have to be." She stepped closer to the gate, pointing her finger at him like she was trying to scold a child. "You think you can intimidate me?" "You don't scare me one bit," he didn't reply. He just stood still, his hands resting on his belt. There was no aggression in his stance, and just quiet authority. That only made her angrier. She dropped the clipboard and reached into her purse. His eyes tracked the movement immediately. Years of training made his mind sharpen in an instant. Her hand came out holding something metallic, and time seemed to slow. It was a small silver handgun. His heart didn't race. His breathing didn't change. Instead, his body moved exactly how it had been trained to move. Calm, controlled, careful. He raised his hand slowly, palms facing her, voice steady. "Karen," he said quietly, "put that down. No one needs to get hurt." She was shaking, but her eyes were wild. "You're threatening me. You came out here to attack me." "I haven't moved toward you," he said gently. "You're standing on my property with a weapon. Let's both take a breath, all right? Just put it down." Her hand trembled. "You think your title means something? You think you can ruin me?" He took a half step back. Not toward her, but away, showing no threat. "No one wants to ruin you. Just listen to me. Let's calm this down." As he spoke, his other hand, and the one near his chest, discreetly pressed a small button under his jacket. It was a body cam he often wore off duty, one that also sent an automatic alert to the sheriff's department if triggered. She kept yelling, waving the gun around, not pointing directly at him but close enough to make the situation dangerous. Her voice cracked with emotion, frustration, fear, pride, all mixed together. "Karen," he said again, soft but firm. "You're not thinking clearly right now. Put it down, please." There was a faint sound in the distance, with sirens, faint at first, then growing louder. She heard them too, her face twisted in confusion. "You called them?" He stayed still. "They're coming to make sure everyone's safe. Just put it down and step away." When the sheriff's cars appeared at the end of the dirt road, lights flashing, she froze. For a moment, she looked lost, like she didn't understand how things had gone this far. The deputies stepped out carefully, hands visible, calling for her to lower the weapon. She hesitated, then dropped it onto the ground. The sound of it hitting the dirt was sharp, final. The deputies quickly secured the area, moving her aside and asking him what had happened. He showed them his badge quietly, explaining everything in a calm, factual tone. When they told her who he was and the police director, her jaw dropped. She looked like all the anger had drained out of her, replaced by disbelief. You tricked me," she stammered. He shook his head gently. "No, Karen, I told you who I was. You just didn't want to believe it." The deputies handled the situation carefully. They didn't treat her roughly. She wasn't violent, just shaken and stubborn. One of them helped her sit on the tailgate of a patrol car while they took her statement. He watched quietly, not out of anger, but with a heavy sense of disappointment. It didn't feel good to see anyone in that position, even someone who had caused him months of trouble. When everything settled, one of the deputies approached him. "We've got it under control, sir. You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, just sad it had to go this far." They collected her weapon for evidence and asked if he wanted to press charges. He paused for a moment. "Not right now," he said. "Let's just make sure she gets evaluated. She's angry, not evil." The deputy nodded in understanding. "We'll handle it." As the patrol cars left, the sound of sirens faded into the distance and the quiet of the ranch returned. The horses had gathered near the fence, ears perked up, sensing the tension. He walked over and patted one gently, letting out a long breath. He replayed the moment in his head, how easily things could have gone wrong, how 1 second of panic could have changed everything. But he also felt grateful that his training, patience, and calm had prevented something irreversible. Later that evening, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunset. The light stretched across the open fields, painting the world gold. He thought about how strange life could be, how someone's obsession with power and control could twist into something so reckless. He didn't hate her. He just hoped she would understand the weight of what she had done. Maybe this was the moment that would make her see how far she had gone. As night fell, he turned off the porch light and looked out at the stars. The peace he had moved here for finally felt close again, even if only for a moment. He knew there would be more to handle. Reports, HOA fallout, maybe court hearings, but for now, he was just thankful that everyone was alive, that no one had been hurt, and that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the end of all the chaos. He took one last sip of his coffee and whispered to himself, "Some people never realize who they're talking to until it's too late." Then he smiled faintly, not out of pride but relief, and went back inside, closing the door on a day he would never forget. The next morning, the ranch was quiet again, but something felt different. The air seemed clearer, lighter somehow. The man walked outside with his cup of coffee, the sun just starting to rise over the trees. The dew on the grass shimmered like little sparks of light, and his horses lifted their heads when they saw him, calm and gentle as always. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the cool morning air. The events from the day before still replayed in his mind. Karen's trembling hands, the sound of the sirens, the look on her face when she realized who he really was. It hadn't been satisfying to prove her wrong. If anything, it had been sad. It showed how far someone could fall when pride and anger took over reason. He wasn't angry anymore. He just felt tired. A few hours later, a sheriff's car pulled into his driveway. The deputy who had been there yesterday stepped out and gave him a small nod. "Morning, sir," he said respectfully. "Morning," the man replied. "How's she doing?" The deputy sighed. "She's being evaluated. She was emotional but cooperative after we got her calmed down. The HOA board called in. Looks like they're already trying to figure out how to handle the situation." The man nodded quietly. "That's probably for the best." The deputy hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You sure you don't want to press charges? What she did was serious." He looked out over his land, the open space that had drawn him here in the first place. "I know," he said softly. "But sometimes ruining someone's life doesn't fix anything. I just want peace." The deputy nodded, understanding the kind of calm strength that came from years in law enforcement. They shook hands and the car drove away, leaving only the sound of birds and the rustling of the wind. That evening, he received a call from one of the HOA board members. The man's voice was nervous, overly polite, and full of apologies. "We had no idea things had gone this far," he said. "Karen acted on her own. The board doesn't support her behavior." The director didn't sound angry. "I'm not looking for revenge," he said simply. "I just want to make sure no one else gets harassed the way I did. People move here for peace. Let's try to give them that." The board member agreed and promised that steps would be taken immediately. Karen would be suspended from all HOA duties, and they'd be reviewing the association's rules to prevent abuses of power. After that call, the man sat on his porch again, watching the last light fade from the sky. He could finally hear silence. The kind of silence that comes when everything that needed to happen had already happened. Over the next few weeks, word spread around the neighborhood about what had happened. Most of the neighbors were shocked, though many admitted they had seen hints of Karen's temper long before. People started coming by more often, not out of gossip but out of respect. Some brought pies, others brought small gifts or kind words. One older couple stopped by one afternoon. The woman smiled gently and said, "You handled that with grace. I don't think many people would have stayed that calm." He smiled faintly. "Calm is what saves people," he said. "Panic only makes bad things worse." They nodded, and for the first time in months he felt like part of the community. People weren't avoiding him anymore. They were including him, talking to him, asking about his ranch, offering to help with little things. It was a quiet kind of acceptance, but a real one. As for Karen, she kept to herself after the incident. Her house stayed quiet. Sometimes he would see her car drive by slowly, but she never stopped, never caused any more trouble. A few neighbors mentioned that she had gone through counseling and that her family was helping her move to another area to start fresh. He didn't wish her harm. If anything, he hoped she would find peace too. Everyone deserves that chance. One morning, as he was fixing the gate, he saw her walking on the opposite side of the road. She looked different, tired, smaller somehow, but calmer. For a moment, they made eye contact. She stopped, then nodded slightly. It wasn't an apology spoken out loud, but he understood what it meant. He nodded back. That small gesture closed the chapter more completely than any court case ever could. Life slowly returned to the way it was meant to be. The days were filled with simple work, tending the horses, fixing fences, watching the seasons change. He went back to his office a few days each week, handling department matters, mentoring younger officers, teaching them the same lesson he'd lived through. Patience and calm are a lawman's strongest weapons. At home, he found himself smiling more. He planted a few new trees near the edge of the property, wanting to add shade and life to the land. He even started letting a few kids from the neighborhood visit the ranch on weekends to see the horses and learn how to ride safely. The laughter and energy they brought made the place feel alive again. One evening, as he was sitting by the corral watching the sunset, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the same neighbor who had warned him earlier about Karen's gossip. The text read, "Looks like the HOA is changing its rules. They're requiring more checks before anyone can act alone. You did some good here." He looked at the message and smiled. He hadn't set out to change anything, but sometimes doing the right thing quietly ends up fixing more than you realize. A few days later, he was invited to speak at a small community safety event in town. They wanted him to talk about conflict resolution, how to handle tense situations without letting them explode. He agreed. When he stood at the podium, he didn't use big words or fancy stories. He just spoke from the heart. "I've learned that most people who act out of anger aren't evil," he said to the small crowd. "They're scared. Scared of losing control. Scared of being ignored. Scared that someone else is taking away their sense of power. But anger doesn't fix anything. It only builds walls between people." He paused, looking at the faces, listening quietly. Sometimes the best thing you can do in a fight is not fight back. Stay calm. Let people see that peace isn't weakness, it's strength. When he finished, there was a soft round of applause. Not loud or dramatic, but warm and respectful. Afterward, a few people came up to thank him. One woman said, "You probably saved that lady's life by not reacting with force." "That's something," he nodded. "We all make choices," he said. "That was mine." When he drove home that evening, the sky was painted in streaks of orange and pink. The wind blew gently through the open truck window, carrying the faint scent of pine and fresh soil. As he turned onto the gravel road leading to his ranch, he smiled again. That small, content kind of smile that only comes from knowing peace has finally settled in. The following weekend, he had visitors, a couple of new families who had just moved into the area. They brought their kids to meet him and see the horses. As he showed them around, one of the new neighbors said, "We heard this place is the safest and calmest part of the county. Guess we know why now." He chuckled lightly. "It's not about safety," he said. "It's about respect. Everyone just wants to live without being bothered." That night, as the stars filled the sky again, he sat on the porch thinking back on everything. The arguments, the letters, the meeting, the moment at the gate. It all seemed so far away now, like a different lifetime. He thought about how quickly things can spiral when people forget the simple truth that everyone just wants peace in their own space. He also realized how important it was to stay kind even when people don't deserve it, because anger only makes the world heavier. When the wind rustled through the trees and the crickets began their quiet song, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. The world finally felt right again, and somewhere deep inside, he was grateful for every twist and turn that had led him here, because without all of it, he might never have truly appreciated what peace really meant. He whispered softly to himself, "Sometimes you don't need to fight to win. You just need to stand still and let the truth show itself." The porch light flickered gently in the wind as he took one last look at the stars before heading inside. The ranch was calm, the night was still, and for the first time in a long while he knew that everything was exactly as it should be.